She stared at the plate like it was an insult. A thick slab of steak, perfectly seared, pink at the center, rested beside mashed potatoes that still steamed in the dry Texas air. Around her, laughter rose from the American mess tent. Forks scraped plates. Boots thudded on wood floors. A cowboy turned camp cook, wiped his hands and said gently, "Eat, miss. You need it." But she didn't move. Not the first day, not the second, not the seventh. Every time the steak was offered, she refused. Sat silent, back straight, hands in her lap. And the cowboys, used to silence in the saddle, not from dinner tables, began to wonder. Why? They'd seen hunger before. This was something else, a different kind of pain. When one of them finally pressed the issue, her answer stopped him cold. It wasn't the steak itself, it was what steak meant. And the truth would shake even the hardest men. The camp sat low and wide on the Texas plain, a sprawl of orderly barracks and long gravel roads framed by barbed wire and mesquite trees. The air was dry, rich with dust and the scent of sweat-worn leather. It wasn't the hell they'd been promised, not for the prisoners and not for the guards. This place had rhythm, a strange kind of peace, and the men who ran it, mostly ranchers, turned soldiers, cowboys turned cooks, took pride in the order they kept. They called it Camp Owens, though the women inside rarely said the name aloud. They had just arrived, a small group of captured Japanese auxiliaries transported by ship and train across an ocean and a continent. Most were nurses, clerks, or radio operators. None had seen anything like Texas. The American guards didn't quite know what to make of them. The women spoke little, moved carefully, and kept to themselves with a discipline that unsettled even the most stoic cowboys. One guard joked that they moved like ghosts. Another said they reminded him of prairie deer, wide-eyed, jumpy, always watching the exits. The Americans, in turn, tried to be decent. They offered blankets, books, soap, and food. Especially food. Always food. Hot, heavy meals served on tin trays 3 times a day, no exceptions. It was the way they understood kindness, through what could be fried, grilled, boiled, or buttered. But one woman kept refusing. She sat at the end of the table, back straight, tray untouched. Her hair was tied in a clean bun. Her uniform, issued just days earlier, was pressed and folded neatly at the collar. Her hands rested in her lap. The first time she passed up the steak, nobody noticed. The second time, a cook raised his brow. The third time, Dalton, the cowboy running the mess that week, started keeping count. Every evening she walked through the line. Every evening she took the tray. And every evening, when the guards cleared the tables, her steak sat cold and whole, the fork untouched beside it. Dalton asked around. Some of the guards had started calling her Miss No Touch. Others simply said she was strange. One said, "I think she's scared of it." But it wasn't fear, at least not the kind the Americans understood. She would eat the bread, sometimes the beans, even the greens if they weren't too bitter. But not the meat, especially not the steak. It became a kind of ritual, an invisible standoff. Steak was pride here, cut thick, grilled over open flame, salted like the cowboy's own memories. To reject it felt like a statement, even if it wasn't meant to be one. The guards tried to ignore it, but in truth, they were baffled. She wasn't rude. She bowed when spoken to. She said, "Thank you," in halting English. She helped clean up after meals. And yet, the steak stayed, day after day. Dalton began to linger in the mess hall, pretending to check supplies while watching her. He tried once, gently, offering her a smaller portion with a smile. She looked up, bowed again, and said, "No, thank you." Her voice was soft, not defiant. Her eyes didn't meet his. To the men of Camp Owens, this was a mystery. They'd seen all kinds of reactions from prisoners: rage, fear, begging, silence, but never something like this. Never a woman who smiled politely while refusing what they saw as a gift. It wasn't political, it wasn't religious. It was deeper than that, and no one could name it. Dalton watched her one night from the kitchen window as she sat alone in the twilight, her hands folded on the table in front of her, the steak still untouched. She looked out past the fence, past the trees, toward nothing, like she was waiting for something that would never come. He lit a cigarette and didn't finish it. Whatever this was, it wasn't about the food. It was about something that had happened long before Texas, and he had a feeling he wasn't going to like the answer. Her name was Natsuko, though she had never offered it. One of the other women had whispered it once during roll call, a soft syllable caught between wind and breath. Dalton had memorized it the moment he heard it. There was something about the way it settled into the dust, soft but anchored. Natsuko. He didn't say it out loud, not yet. It felt too private, like opening a letter that wasn't his to read. The others were starting to thaw. A few of the younger women had begun folding laundry beside the American wives who volunteered near the camp. Others picked up books, murmured halting English phrases, even traded shy smiles with guards when the sun was kind and the coffee hot. But Natsuko stayed on the edge of everything. She never pushed or resisted, just hovered in that quiet, impossible space between acceptance and refusal. Dalton watched her, the way a rancher watches a wild animal approach a fence. No sudden movements, no raised voice, just time. But every gesture he tried bounced off her silence. He left her a clean blanket once, folded neatly at the edge of her cot. She didn't touch it for 2 days. He brought her a flower, bluebonnet, from the edge of the barracks, and placed it in a chipped glass near her tray. The next day it was gone, not thrown out, just gone, as if it had never been there. The camp was built on routine. Every morning came with reveille and porridge, every evening with stew and quiet. But Dalton started noticing the little ways Natsuko disrupted that rhythm. Not by doing anything wrong, but by doing everything just a little too perfectly. Her bed was the first made. Her boots were always polished. She bowed just enough, never more. He came to think of her not as quiet, but sealed, like a letter left unopened for too long. One afternoon, with the sun falling in long gold stripes through the fence slats, he found her in the yard, standing alone near the laundry lines. He didn't speak. He didn't want to startle her. Instead, he crouched in the dirt between them and drew slowly with the tip of a twig. Just 4 characters, Roman letters, her name, Natsuko. He didn't look at her while he wrote, just traced the letters carefully into the sun-warmed dust. Then he stood and stepped back. She stared at it for a long time. He couldn't read her face. Was it anger? Embarrassment? Something worse? She stepped forward, slowly, lifted her foot, and brushed her boot across the letters, erasing them without a word. But she didn't walk away. Dalton felt his heart pound louder than it should have. She was still standing there, watching the erased patch of dust, hands folded in front of her. Then, as the wind picked up, she turned her head slightly, just enough for him to hear her voice. "Please, do not write." He nodded. No apology, no excuse. Just a quiet agreement. The air between them held still like a held breath. And for the first time, she looked at him, not through him, not past him, at him. It lasted less than a second, but he would remember it for the rest of his life. After that, something shifted. She still didn't speak, still didn't eat the steak, but she no longer vanished after meals. She lingered, sometimes in the yard, sometimes near the fence. Dalton never approached again. He just made sure her tray was lighter, simpler. Beans, bread, fruit if there was any, no meat. The men teased him, said he had a soft spot for the ghost girl. Maybe he did, but he wasn't trying to fix her. He just didn't want to break what silence she had left. Something had been taken from her long before she ever arrived here, and though he couldn't give it back, maybe, just maybe, he could stop it from being taken again. Before the red dust of Texas, before the barbed wire and bluebonnets, there had been green, endless, choking green. The jungle in Luzon was not a place where things lived. It was a place where they clung, where rot hung in the air like smoke, and where breath itself felt borrowed. Natsuko had arrived there in early spring, when the rain had not yet softened the ground, and the dead were still being buried in shallow graves. She was 20, maybe less, and already knew how to set bones and stitch open wounds with shaking fingers. She served in a field station that wasn't a station at all, just a series of bamboo walls lashed together with rope and desperation. The floor was always damp, blood never dried. Men came in screaming and left silent, their names scratched into the wood beams overhead. There was no morphine. When she amputated a leg, she used a bone saw heated over a lantern. The soldier bit down on leather until it tore. Afterward, he thanked her. Food was a memory, not a guarantee. Each nurse received a ration, 1 handful of rice per day. On bad days, that rice was half husk, half insect. They boiled it in rusted tins over firewood stolen from the jungle floor. They added leaves when they could, salt when a dying man gave up his packet, but never meat, never anything like what sizzled on American grills across the ocean. Meat was power. It came wrapped in wax paper and carried by officers in iron tins. Natsuko watched once as an officer, high-ranking, clean boots, starched collar, sat under a palm leaf canopy and unwrapped a piece of steak. It was thick, glistening, cooked rare and still steaming. The smell cut through the rot and sweat and blood like incense. She felt her stomach twist. 10 feet away, a boy no older than 16 lay dying. He had a fever high enough to boil tears from his eyes. His belly was sunken, his lips cracked. He whispered something Natsuko never forgot. "I do not want to die hungry." The officer didn't hear or didn't care. He took a bite, chewed slowly, smiled. The boy died before sunset. After that, steak was no longer food. It was a monument to cruelty. It was the sound of teeth tearing flesh while others wasted away. It became the smell of injustice, and it seared itself into Natsuko's memory deeper than any wound. Years later, even when her body was safe, her mind still crouched in that jungle, listening to boots splash through blood and rain. The class divide in the Imperial Army was absolute. Officers ate, nurses obeyed. Enlisted men suffered. You could die with your hands on a bandage and your stomach screaming, and no one would offer you more than a grunt. Yet the officers, who gave orders from clean tents, drank imported whiskey and demanded beef. The nurses, who kept the wounded alive, chewed bark to keep from fainting. In Texas, when Natsuko smelled steak, it wasn't just memory. It was betrayal, alive again. Her hunger was never just in her belly. It had become a kind of shame. To eat steak now, even freely given, felt like becoming the very thing she had loathed. She remembered one night, near the end, when the jungle was quiet and defeat crept like smoke through every tent. She had found a scrap of dried fish tucked in the pocket of her uniform. She didn't eat it. She split it between 2 men with wounds too deep to survive. She placed the pieces in their hands, wiped the sweat from their brows, and waited until they could chew. That was food. That was ritual. That was respect. Texas had plenty, but her body had learned to survive without abundance. and her soul had learned that not all hunger should be fed. Dalton didn't know that. All he saw was a woman who wouldn't eat, a steak left untouched day after day, a silence that filled the mess hall heavier than the smell of grease and fire. He told himself it wasn't his problem, but the truth was, it got under his skin. Like a splinter you don't remember getting until it starts to ache. He'd been to war, too, served in the Pacific, saw the wreckage of villages, the flash of gunfire between palm trees, the heat that never left your clothes. He watched a buddy bleed out from a stomach wound so deep it looked like the earth had opened him. He'd shot a man once who hadn't even raised his weapon. After the war, he came home with his uniform folded and his sleep shattered. The army offered him a paycheck to stay on. "Guard duty," they said. "No combat, just keep order." So he took it. Better than drifting, but the war never really left. It lived in the edge of his voice and the stiffness in his shoulders. Most days the job was quiet. The women prisoners weren't a threat. Tired, thin, polite to a fault. Most tried their best to fade into the routines, sweep, wash, eat, sleep. But Natsuko was different. She didn't act out. She didn't defy. She just refused the stake, and not with disgust, not with fear, with something closer to reverence, like the plate carried ghosts. One afternoon he found her alone by the garden fence, sitting on a low bench under the slanting shade of the barracks. Her hands were folded in her lap. She wasn't crying. She never cried. That's what bothered him. The ones who wept, he understood. This stillness, that was something else. He walked up slowly, boots crunching on the dirt. She didn't flinch, but she didn't look up either. He stood beside her for a moment, not speaking. Then he said it. "Why won't you eat it?" No preamble, no false kindness. Just the question that had haunted him every dinner shift for weeks. Natsuko blinked once, then turned her head slightly. Her face was calm. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. "Because," she said slowly, the words thick with effort, "last time I smell steak, a man die." Dalton didn't move, didn't breathe. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. The silence that followed was sharper than any detail. It carved the air between them. She looked back down at her hands. "I remember," she said after a pause. "Smell, fire, meat, and blood." Dalton looked away. He felt something shift in his chest, like a window opening where a wall had been. He thought of his own memories, the smell of burned rice in Manila, the steam rising off jungle mud, a pair of boots sticking out from under a broken cart, motionless. He knew the way scents could bury themselves in your mind, fuse with horror until they became sacred, untouchable. He took off his hat, held it in both hands. "I didn't know," he said. Natsuko gave the faintest nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgment. She wasn't trying to make him feel bad. She was just telling the truth. He stood there for another long minute, unsure what to do with his hands, his guilt, or the lump rising in his throat. Then he turned and walked back toward the mess hall, the sun falling hard against his shoulders. That evening, when the trays were handed out, hers had no steak, just beans, rice, a few slices of apple. She looked at it. Then, for the first time, she picked up her fork without hesitation. But memory is not undone by kindness. It lingers in the blood, in the folds of the mind, in smells and sounds that pull you back before you even know it's happening. That evening in Texas, as Natsuko brought the fork to her lips and tasted the sweetness of the apple, she did not think of Dalton or Camp Owens or the rust-colored light spilling through the barracks window. She thought of the jungle. She thought of the day everything changed. It had been late in the war, But no one said that out loud. To speak of defeat was to invite it. Still, the whispers were spreading, islands lost, ships vanished, air raids growing louder. In the bamboo field post, the wounded overflowed from mats to dirt, and the nurses moved like shadows from one broken body to the next. Blood was a constant, the scent of it so thick it coated the back of the throat. Then came the officer, clean boots, pressed uniform, pistol at his side. He did not look down at the men moaning at his feet. He stepped over them. He entered the officer's tent, a space cordoned off with canvas and tarps, where the mud was swept and the lanterns burned brighter. Natsuko was summoned, not with a shout, not with urgency, with a finger pointed in silence. Inside she found a table, real wood, scrubbed, a plate, silver and shining, and on it, steak, cooked rare, still steaming. The smell hit her first. It was not food, it was power. The officer sat, loosening his collar. "Bring it," he said. She obeyed. Hands trembling, knees stiff, she lifted the plate and crossed the floor. Behind her, just beyond the canvas, a man called for water. Another cried for his mother. She knew both voices. She had changed their dressings that morning. She stood beside the officer and placed the steak before him. He didn't thank her. He didn't speak again. He picked up his knife, carved a slice, chewed slowly, closed his eyes as if tasting peace itself. Natsuko stood frozen. She could still see the outline of the wounded through the canvas wall, bodies shifting in pain. One of them tried to sit up. He was begging, his voice no louder than a leaf brushing the ground. The officer took another bite. That moment split her, not just in anger, not just in helplessness, in shame, not hers, but shared, that she had held the plate, that she had been part of a ritual that fed the powerful while the dying faded beside them. That night, one of the men she'd treated passed in his sleep. She had no bandages left for him, no water, no words. From then on, the smell of steak became something else, a warning, a betrayal. A memory not just of war, but of the hierarchy that made cruelty elegant. Years later, across the ocean, she would smell it again, not from officers, but from cowboys with warm smiles and polite eyes. But her body didn't know the difference. Her chest would tighten, her hands would tremble. It was the same smell. In Texas, they meant well. They thought steak was kindness. But kindness has a language, and no one had ever spoken it to her in meat. She learned to eat again, slowly, rice, fruit, beans, but steak. Steak was a wound with a scent that brought her back to a wooden table in a canvas tent, to a silver plate and a dying man calling for water, and some memories. Do not spoil. They age, they season, and they wait. When the Red Cross arrived at Camp Owens with parcels and paper, many of the women lined up eagerly. They were told they could write letters home, small ones. Censored, of course, only a few lines allowed. Still, it was something, a bridge to a world they might never see again. But Natsuko didn't take a page. She shook her head gently when asked and stepped aside. No one pressed her. Perhaps her family was gone. Perhaps she didn't know where to send it. Or maybe she simply had nothing left to say to a world that had watched her vanish. But she did write. In the quiet hours of early morning, long before the camp stirred, she took out a small book, no larger than a hand, wrapped in cloth and bound with string. She had made it herself, carefully folding scraps of paper until they held shape. Inside, she wrote in tiny, perfect script. Japanese characters, tightly drawn, the ink sometimes smudged from fingers too cold or too tired. The diary was not for the world. It was not even for her future self. It was a confession, a witness, a way to put language to things that would otherwise dissolve into silence. She wrote about hunger, not the ache in the stomach, but the one in the soul, the shame of waking up, fed while others, back home, might be starving in ruins. She wrote of the nightmares, the sound of saws, the scent of blood. She wrote of the stake, how it still came in dreams, sizzling and cruel. She wrote about the guilt of swallowing food when her brothers in arms had died with empty mouths. Sometimes she cursed herself, not for surviving, but for not dying with more purpose. And then she would stop, press her fingers to the page, and sit in silence, her body still. Only her eyes moved, reading and rereading what could never be spoken aloud. Dalton never knew about the diary. Not until one day, after a windstorm swept through the camp, shaking loose tarps and papers and trays. He was helping clear debris from the women's barracks when he saw it, a small cloth-wrapped bundle beneath a cot, half buried in dust. He crouched, picked it up, brushed off the dirt. He felt the weight of it, not heavy in mass, but heavy in meaning. He could have opened it. No one was watching. His fingers hovered over the string, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the cloth was folded, reverent, almost like a prayer. Maybe it was the memory of her eyes, the steadiness with which she had said, "Please, do not write." Maybe he had learned, finally, that some things are not meant to be understood, only respected. So he placed it back, exactly where it had been, tucked the corner of the blanket over it, and left. That evening, Natsuko found it just as she had left it. She knew someone had touched it. The thread was looped a little differently, but the pages were untouched, and that, to her, said more than any words. After that day, when she passed Dalton in the yard, she nodded. Not the quick, impersonal bow of obligation, but something deeper, recognition. In a place built on rules, on watching and control, he had chosen not to look. He had chosen silence. And for a woman whose entire life had been twisted by the violence of power, that choice, the absence of intrusion, was the first real kindness she had known in years. Dalton didn't know what kind of gesture it was when he handed her the packet of seeds. Maybe just something to break the monotony, maybe something else. He'd found it tucked in a shipment from a local church. "For the women," a note had said in loopy handwriting. It wasn't much. Basil, tomato, beans. But when he passed it to Natsuko that morning, he didn't give her instructions, just nodded toward the far edge of the yard, where sunlight clung longest, and said, "Maybe grow something." She looked down at the seeds, then at the corner of the yard. No words. But that afternoon she cleared a patch of earth. At first it was slow. The soil was stubborn, clay thick and dry. But she worked it patiently, like she had once tended wounds. She turned it, softened it with water from the mess. Her hands, once used to bandages and blood, now brushed gently against green. Tomatoes, then beans. Basil in the middle. A thin line of plants behind a fence that still kept her inside, but no longer made her feel entirely buried. She never called it a garden, but the others began to. The German women shared scraps of cloth to tie the shoots. One American nurse smuggled a trowel through the gate, and every day Natsuko knelt there, weeding, watering, watching. Something shifted in her. It wasn't loud, it wasn't visible, not at first, but in the way she moved, in the stillness that now seemed less like silence and more like listening. You could tell. She was no longer just surviving. She was growing something. The garden became her rebellion, not angry, not loud, but sacred. Where war had taken everything, here she gave life. It was the first time since the jungle that her hands were met, not with rot, but with the soft, sweet promise of fruit. Weeks passed. One morning, just before breakfast, she found it. The first tomato. Ripe, red, full, small, but perfect. She wiped it gently on her sleeve, held it in her palm, and stared at it for a long time. Then, at the lunch shift, she waited until Dalton was alone in the mess. She stepped forward, quiet as always, and placed the tomato on his tray. No bow, no thank you, just the tomato, a gift. Dalton looked down at it, and something in his chest stirred, the same ache he'd felt the first time he saw her erase her name from the dirt. He didn't speak, just nodded. And when dinner came that night, her tray arrived without steak. Instead, it held rice, a few beans, and 2 slices of apple. She accepted it, sat down, ate slowly. They never talked about the garden, never named the tomato. But something unspoken had passed between them, and it held more weight than any order or letter. She grew food. He respected her silence. In a place built for control, they had found a different rhythm, one shaped not by rank or war, but by care. From that day on, every time a new plant ripened, she saved the first fruit. Sometimes she placed it on his tray, sometimes on the corner of the fence post where he'd find it, and every time her meal came back simple, clean, never steak. It was a language neither of them had learned, but both of them spoke. It was late summer when the steak returned. A celebration, something about the armistice, or maybe just an excuse for the officers to show good faith. The mess hall was decorated with paper streamers. A band played a loose version of Sentimental Journey, and the kitchen worked overtime. For the first time in months, the scent of steak returned to Camp Owens, thick, rich, heavy in the lungs like smoke. Natsuko smelled it before she saw it. The moment it hit her nose, time warped. The world flickered, Texas dissolving, replaced by canvas tents and crying men. Her fingers clenched, her breath caught. But then she opened her eyes. The garden was still there, just outside. The basil growing strong, the tomatoes heavy on the vine, and the tray in her hands, not forced upon her, not a command, but a choice. She stared at the steak. It looked no different. Same cut, same glistening fat, but it was not the same. Because she was not the same? She walked to her table, sat. All around her, women chatted, laughed nervously, tried to enjoy the rare luxury. The guards mingled. Someone had brought a phonograph. She didn't touch the knife right away. She placed her hands on either side of the tray, grounding herself. Her eyes closed. She thought of the diary, of the men she had nursed, of the first tomato, of Dalton's silence, of her mother, whose voice she hadn't heard in years. And then, slowly, deliberately, she picked up the knife, cut a single piece, raised it to her lips. The smell hit her again, but this time it was different. Not a weapon, not a wound, just scent, just meat. She chewed slowly, not out of hunger, out of defiance, out of ownership. The steak had once been a symbol of cruelty, of a system that fed the powerful and left the weak to rot. But now, in this moment, she was not powerless. She was not voiceless. She had grown life from dust. She had written words no one could take, and she had taught a man to listen with his silence. This bite, this simple act, was hers. Dalton saw it from across the room. Their eyes met for just a second. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his hat or gesture. He just nodded. A small motion, nearly imperceptible. But to her, it was thunder. No one else noticed. No one else needed to. She ate 2 more bites, then pushed the plate away. Not because she couldn't finish, because she didn't need to prove anything more. She had eaten steak, and it had not eaten her. She stood, left the tray where it was, and walked outside. The sky was turning orange. The garden shimmered in the light. She reached down, plucked a basil leaf, rubbed it between her fingers. The scent rose, sharp, fresh, alive. It replaced the steak. She was free now, not from the camp, not from fences, but from the grip the past had held on her body. In a war defined by power, she had taken something back, and she had done it without raising her voice. If you're moved by this story so far, hit the like button and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. That night, Natsuko sat on the edge of her cot with a sheet of paper in her lap. It was smooth, uncreased, the kind the Red Cross had passed out months ago. She had kept it hidden, untouched, beneath her mattress, waiting. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she hadn't known how to say it. Not until now. The pencil felt foreign in her hand, too light, too blunt. She sharpened it with the edge of a spoon and let the first word come slow. "I am not hungry now." She paused, looked at the sentence. It was true, not just in her stomach, in her bones, in her breath. I plant things. She thought of the basil, the beans, the tomato vines winding up the fence like they had somewhere to be. I sleep without boots on. That was new. It had taken her almost a year to stop lacing them each night, just in case. But now her feet rested bare beneath the wool blanket. I remembered my name today. Not the one the guards used, not nurse, not miss, but her name, her real one, the one her mother whispered before sleep. And I ate the thing I feared. She underlined that sentence, then stopped. The paper didn't need more. She didn't write about the war, about the jungle, about the dead. Some stories were too large for letters. Some memories had no grammar. She folded the page with care. 3 creases, no smudges, tied it with a thin string from her sewing kit, and placed it in an envelope. Morning came warm, dusty. She stepped out as the sun began to rise and crossed the yard. Dalton was stacking crates by the gate. She approached him quietly, as always, held out the letter with both hands. He took it, solemn. No jokes, no raised eyebrows, just a small dip of his head. Then she bowed. Not stiffly, not out of obligation, but with intention. It was the only letter she ever wrote from Camp Owens. She didn't know if it would reach anyone, didn't know if there was anyone left to read it. But that was never the point. Writing it was the act. Sending it was the release. For months she had spoken only in silence, in food, in planting. This was something else, a bridge between what was and what might be. She had chosen to speak, not because she had to, but because it was time. Later that week, a breeze carried the scent of tomato leaves into the barracks. Someone sang in German near the wash basins. A baby cried in the distance, one of the local farmhands' children. Life, in all its absurdity, kept happening. Natsuko lay back on her cot and looked up at the ceiling. The wood panels above were cracked, worn, painted over again and again. But they held, and so did she. The letter was gone now, carried off in a canvas mail sack, tucked between packages and ration forms. But she could still feel it. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a beginning. A quiet declaration that she had lived, that she had chosen, that she had written her name, not erased it. The announcement came without ceremony. No band, no speeches. Just a notice posted near the gates and a quiet change in the way the guards stood at attention. The war was over. Repatriation would begin. Names would be called. Ships assigned. Time, at last, would move forward. Natsuko listened as others reacted, gasps, sobs, hands flying to mouths. Some women collapsed onto benches, overwhelmed by relief or fear. Others stood frozen, unsure what it meant to return to a country they no longer recognized, if it still existed at all. Natsuko felt neither joy nor dread. What she felt was something steadier, a calm that came from having already crossed the most dangerous distance, the one inside herself. She packed little. There had never been much to own. From beneath her cot, she took the diary, wrapped in cloth as always. From the garden, she gathered seeds, tomato, basil, beans, dried carefully in scraps of paper and tied into a small pouch. And from the kitchen, on the morning she was to leave, Dalton handed her one final object, a steak knife. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. It wasn't sharp anymore, the edge worn smooth from months of use. It was not a weapon. It was a marker, a reminder of what had once been taken from her, and what she had taken back. She accepted it with both hands, bowed. They did not say goodbye. They stood there in the pale Texas morning, the fence behind them casting long shadows. Then she turned and walked toward the truck that would take her to the port. She did not look back. The ship that carried her across the ocean was crowded and quiet. Women sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching bundles, staring at the horizon. Some whispered prayers, some stared into space. Natsuko stood at the rail as the coastline faded, the salt air tugging at her hair. She did not cry. She thought of the garden, of the first tomato, of the steak she had eaten and left behind, of the letter already gone. Japan rose from the sea like a memory half buried. The ports were broken. Buildings stood cracked open like ribs. Smoke hung low, even now. She stepped onto the dock and felt the ground beneath her feet. Thinner, hungrier, but still alive. Home was not what she remembered, but she was not who she had been. She planted the seeds in soil she did not recognize. She wrote in her diary by candlelight. She used the knife to cut vegetables, never meat. She slept without boots on. And sometimes, when neighbors spoke of the enemy with bitterness, she said nothing. Silence, she had learned, could be a choice, not an erasure. Back in Texas, spring came as it always did. The fence still stood. The barracks were quiet. But behind them, in the corner where sunlight lingered longest, something unexpected happened. The garden returned. Tomato vines climbed where no one had planted them. Basil spread, fragrant and stubborn. Beans curled around the wire as if testing its strength. The cowboys noticed. One of them laughed and said the land remembered. Dalton stood at the edge of the fence and watched the plants grow wild. He never saw her again, but he didn't need to. Some stories don't end where the people do. They continue in small, living things, in the way someone chooses not to intrude, in a meal served differently, in seeds passed from one hand to another. Natsuko had arrived in Texas, silent and starving. She left whole, and the garden behind the barracks told the rest. If this story moved you, please like the video and comment below where you're watching from. These stories deserve to be remembered.